There were 4 of them. They were very uncooperative. And she was trying to get them across, and it kind of reminded me of how uncooperative the tribes of Israel were with God. This mother, she got all of them across, but one of them stayed on the other side and was going up a tree. And then the mother came across the highway to try to get that other cub that was going up the tree. And one of the cubs, one of the 3 that she had already taken over, followed her over. And so it was an amazing little video that I saw. And you can kind of picture this. This is that little uncooperative guy. And he's trying, and then here comes another one. And I just think of Israel here and how uncooperative they were with God. But one of the things that you can see in here is that this mother, she was patient and she was persistent. She did not give up on those little guys. And whenever you think about persistence and patience, it really goes together. We understand that. We understand how we need persistence and patience. And look at that. They're finally going to accomplish the task. And then here comes the little rebel. Watch this. There he goes. He's looking back. Isn't that something? Then here comes the mother with the one following. And you can see all of this. This is just unbelievable when you think of it. But not unbelievable, but amusing. I think of Paul when he writes to the church at Colossae. And he says, may you be made strong with all the strength that comes from his glorious power. And may you be prepared to endure everything with patience while joyfully giving thanks to the Father. And so we see that Paul combines this idea of endurance, persistence, with patience. We know how important that is. Israel rebels. I was reading in Judges chapter 10 recently. And you can see that Israel rebels, so God sends a judge to save them. They save them, then they rebel again, and another judge is sent. Then they rebel again, and another judge is sent. And it reminds me of what the psalmist, how he describes God. The Lord works righteousness, does justice for all who are oppressed. God made his ways known to Moses, made his deeds known to the Israelites. The Lord is compassionate and merciful, very patient and full of faithful love. We can see that he is compassionate, merciful, very patient. We can be thankful for that. And faithful with love toward us. For several years, they would invade these Amalekites and Midianites. They would invade Israel at harvest time, taking their harvest and their livestock. And finally, after 7 years of this, Israel cried out to God. And when they cried out to God, that's praying to God. That doesn't seem very strange to me, because what we find is that they were doing evil in the sight of God. But they finally, and a lot of people do this, they'll try to do whatever they can in every way they can, and then the last thing they do is pray. Which should be one of the first things they do. But this went on for 7 years like this, the Amalekites, the Midianites coming. Now you think about this, they finally, after 7 years, they pray. In contrast, Paul was always praying to the Lord. That's what he instructed the church at Thessalonica to do. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. When Paul says pray continually, that doesn't mean he was always down on his knees praying. How could he be a missionary? How could he accomplish anything if that's what it means? Or that he was always saying something, you can see his mouth moving. No. The idea of praying continually has to do with you realize that God is always in your presence. You always have access to God. And he's ready to listen. In other words, have a sense of dependence upon him. Has Israel remembered this promise recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. I don't think they're remembering. Because look at what is happening to them. time after time, they rebelled. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. For 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. We see the problem with this verse. And you can see they weren't praying. The problem was that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so what were they doing? These swarms would come. And according to Judges chapter 6, because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. And they camped on the land, and they ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, and remember, they finally, after 7 years of this, they cried out. They cried out to the Lord for help. Well, he sends a prophet. And this prophet says to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt, from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. You have not listened to me. The bright and encouraging spot in this whole story is that God uses, think about this, God uses people who trust in him and people who are willing to be trained. They still knew God, but they weren't praying to him. They weren't obeying him. They weren't listening to him. Today we're going to examine how God used a man who considered himself so insignificant that he would hide from the enemies in the wine press in his village. He was a man whom God could use. He was a man of faith, but that faith was wavering. It needed strengthening. He was a man of humility, but that humility had an inferiority complex about it. He was a man who needed others in order to face the enemy, but not as many as he thought he needed. We find that this man needed to trust in God, and God was willing to train him, wanted to train him, to trust him and to gain more strength and confidence. Remember, they came in swarms. We're going to jump ahead to the big battle when this man trusted in God, resulting in being victorious. And then see how God trained him to trust him for success. And of course, the person we're talking about is Gideon. Now, all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. It would sound practical to face an enemy, and what we find when you read about all of this in Judges chapter 6 and chapter 7, and then you find out how many there were. You have to go into chapter 8, verse 10, and you find out there was 135,000 of them that came. And you can think, well, if you're going to face an enemy and have about an equal force, that would be possible. But this man, Gideon, was able to get 32,000 to come out and to face 135,000. And so there they are, they're camped right near this area. under that hill. Right there, 135,000 of them. Here Gideon was called out of insignificance and obscurity to be a leader. And he has these 32,000 men. They've shown up to fight the Midianites. You've got to say something for them for doing that. He must have felt better about it. He wasn't going to face them by himself. He had 32,000 other men to face him. And he knows now that his army will win because God has already told him that there's going to be victory on his part. However, the surprising thing is, and you remember this, that the 32,000 was too many. 32,000 is too many to face 135,000? Yes. There's a possibility they could actually win. 32,000 against 135,000? If they have the right kind of leadership. But that was too many. So God let it be known. And he told Gideon, to anyone who's trembling or fearful, go home. Hey, being that way is contagious for one thing. But anyone like that, go home. To his surprise, 22,000 went home. And still God said, there's 10,000, that's too many. Too many? 10,000 against 135,000? You see, what God did not want them to think, if there were 32,000 and they ended up winning, then they would accredit the victory to themselves and not to God. God did not want them crediting any victory to themselves, but the victory needed to be credited to God himself. And so that's why it was down to 10,000. That was still too many. And so Gideon took the men down to the water. And there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. And so God sends 9,700 home because they went down to the water and they drank like a dog. Well, you know, you could look at that and suppose, well, they were kind of reckless. If they were in the middle of battle, they need to be on the watch, they need to be alert, and to get down like that would be, but if someone, you know, they could still have their eyes out, and they'd be watchful and all of that. Well, we can make those suppositions, but God knew how many would drink water in one of two ways. And he knew how most of them would do it. And so he knew that there would only be 300 left. Those would be the ones to stay. And so all these men, I think we can assume, with a good assumption, is that they were dedicated ones. The ones not afraid to go to battle against the enemy. They're the kind of people that we need to be like, who will be willing to face evil and the destructive nature of sin. And they were the ones willing to trust and obey God. God's guidance gave them victory. And I'm not going to go into the details about this, but it's kind of strange. They were going to have trumpets, smashing jars, torches. It was going to be used in the middle of the night. They were going to separate themselves into 3 different groups and surround that giant winner, 35,000. And they did all of that. And then what happened to the Midianites? They started to panic and they started to fight each other, and they defeated themselves and all of that. But God really defeated them. Only 300 men were left. And God used them for a great victory. Was it really a popular decision, do you think, to send the 9,700 men home who were willing to risk their lives for battle against the Midianites? I don't know if it was popular. Whatever the reaction, his faith and theirs prompted them to obey. They went back home. The other 300 did exactly what they were told to do. They trusted and obeyed in all of that. We know that the 300 men were dedicated, which is the kind of workers we are to pray for according to Jesus. We should pray for workers in the vineyard compassionate, dedicated workers for the Lord. So God uses people who trust and who are willing to be trained. How did Gideon have such confidence and courage to face an army of 135,000 with only 300 men? He wasn't always that confident or bold, so how did he come to have that kind of confidence and courage? Well, God trained him to have that. I want to show you two ways in which he did that. He builds his confidence and he builds his courage. Here's how God trained Gideon to trust. He first of all starts building his confidence by building within him the right way to look at himself. And so we look at this. The angel came to where Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. The angel speaks to him saying, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. I am sending you." Now, did you notice something about what God said there? He said, "Mighty warrior," first of all. And another thing, he said, "the strength you have." I don't know if Gideon knew he had any strength to start with. And that he was a mighty warrior? Well, he didn't know that he had strength or that he had leadership skills. "But Lord," Gideon asked, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." So God chooses Gideon to save Israel. Gideon can't believe it. He has no confidence. He thinks he has no strength, and he even feels insignificant. "My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And so God, over and over again, would choose people who had the same attitude. He wouldn't choose the proud and the arrogant people. He would choose people like Gideon. He chose Jeremiah. When he chose him to be a prophet, Jeremiah said, "Oh, sovereign Lord," I said, "I do not know how to speak. I am only a child." There's no reason to believe that Jeremiah or Gideon were putting on a front, that this is some sort of pious show of humility. Gideon believed that he was incapable of carrying out God's important mission for him. But Gideon's faith in God grew and grew to the point that he is listed in the Hall of Faith, or the Hall, or the Heroes of Faith or Trust in Hebrews chapter 11. Here's what the writer of the book of Hebrews says. He says, "What more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms." Now we look at this. I'm showing you these pictures for a reason, because they actually relate to what Jesus taught. He said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men." But when you think about salt, he said that that is what you are, the salt of the earth. And when we look at salt, it's a preservative, it's a purifying agent, it's a seasoning, adding flavor to food. But when the salt stays right there, it doesn't have any effect. It's coming out of the salt shaker, does it? It was the same way for Gideon. He had to get out of the wine press, and he had to get up and face the opposition. And the opposition wasn't just 135,000 on the battlefield. The opposition was his own family and his own village, his own people. But it's interesting how God views him. Mighty warrior. One who has strength that he didn't even realize. Jesus also says this. He says, you are the salt, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp, put it under a bowl, and put it on a stand, and just light everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Now, if we turned off that light bulb, it would be pitch dark in that room. But can you imagine one light bulb and then another and another? They're all lit. And how well you could see in a room that can be so dark. Well, that's the way it is for us. This is how Jesus looks at us, like salt. We bring flavor to life, to people's lives. We are light to people. That's how he looks at us. Are we looking at ourselves that way? When Gideon said, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family, God replied, the Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together. Gideon is a man who needs God's help for strength. And God has a lot of patience to strengthen him, and eventually does. And that's where we go back to that little example of the mother bear. God's creation, lots of patience, lots of persistence. That's how God was with Gideon. Those very words should build confidence in Gideon, and they do, that he will be with him. They did. And another one was this, how he was building his strength, building his confidence, building his trust, was promising that he would be with him, and also saying how he initially called him. How did he initially call him? Mighty warrior. There he is hiding in the wine press. Mighty warrior. He calls him that, and now Gideon, he didn't think of himself as a mighty warrior, but God did. And he thinks of us as the salt of the earth and the light of the world too. It sounds like those are pleasant words to me. And look what pleasant words do according to Proverbs 16, verse 24. Pleasant words are like honey. They are sweet to the spirit, and they bring healing to the body. Well, healing to the body makes you stronger, doesn't it? We need to become stronger, have more confidence, have more courage in the things that we need to do. And how does he build that courage? Well, he builds that courage by helping him start at home. The Lord said, go in the strength you have and save Israel. And again, he didn't know he had that strength, but he discovers he does. Starting right there in his hometown, in the village there. Gideon defied his father, his family, his neighbors, and eventually others who worshiped Baal. So the first way that God would strengthen him with courage was by having him stand against Baal in his hometown, tearing down the altar of Baal and of Asherah, the female counterpart, and destroying them, taking the wood of Asherah and making an altar out of it to offer to God. He had to do this before he dared face the enemy on the battlefield. Well, he did it. Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you can cut down. After the second bull, and offer the second bull as a burnt offering. So Gideon obeyed the Lord. But he decided to do this all, do you remember, during the night. When everyone was sleeping. He would go out there and he would do it. He was able to get 10 servants somehow to go out there with him and do it in the middle of the night. He did. But still, you think about that, it took courage. It took a little bit of confidence, more trust in God to be able to do that. But he was afraid. And it'd be easy for us to point the critical finger at him and say that if we were challenged to do such a thing, we would do it in the daylight. We would go out, we would face the enemy, we would face evil in the daylight, and we would challenge them. Really? He needed help. He needed to have the courage to be able to do this, and it took steps for him. The first step was just to do it, and do it at night. And he did. He was trusting in God by obeying. He was becoming more and more confident by trusting and obeying God. The townsmen found out that it was Gideon who tore down Baal and the Asherah pole. And they called out to his father that bring him out. He's got to face the consequences. But look what happens. The men of the town demanded of Joash, this is Gideon's father, bring out your son. He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Now, how was God strengthening Gideon? God used his father to support him. Gideon had torn down his father's idol of Baal, which made his father realize the folly of worshiping such an idol. It helped him to realize it. And he stood and he defended his son. But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So he was tearing down the idols, gained his father's support. And that was one of the ways that God was building this courage in his own village at first. Tearing down the idols and then gaining his father's support. Do we need more courage? Do we need more confidence? Where's a good place to start? I'm not saying that your family is your enemy. But that's a good place to start, to build more courage and confidence, to try to help our families the very best we can. It's a good place to start. And then, in doing that, we can build more courage, more confidence, and we can be more helpful to everyone else. Gideon was afraid of the enemy. And can we really blame him when he only has 32,000 men to face an enemy of 135,000? Even before the 32,000 came, he needed confidence and he needed courage to lead them. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised. And so then he asked God to let a dry wool fleece, he sets on the threshing floor, be wet the next morning and everything else around it dry. And he did it. God did it. And then the next day, just the opposite. That he wanted it to be a wet fleece and everything else to be dry around it. So you got a wet fleece and dry around it, a dry fleece and wet around it. God accommodates his requests, thus helping him build his confidence and his courage. So God patiently builds his trust in him, in God. Today, putting out the fleece is a good way to get fleeced. Today, people think that they still need to be putting out the fleece as Gideon did, but what they're doing is not the same. Because Gideon already knew what God's will was, didn't he? He knew exactly what he was to do. He didn't have to figure that out. He knew. And many people today think that if they can put some sort of sign, they set up the sign, by the way, not God. And if God can fulfill this sign, then they'll get a better sense of what God's will is for their lives. It could be all kinds of things, like whether you're to marry someone or get this certain job or move or not move, all of those things, and you put up little signs for it. But the thing that we need to remember is that Gideon did not have all of God's word. He didn't have it. He was there I don't know if he had access to the Torah. That's what there was at the time. And there he is facing the enemy. And God is going to help build his trust, his courage, his confidence in all this. But remember what Paul wrote to the church at Rome. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide will give us hope. And so how do we gain this? We find the simple way for us to trust God more and do his will is in this passage. Proverbs 16:20. Whoever gives heed to instruction prospers, and blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. Well, look, if you're going to prosper, you see blessed there in the second line. We see give heed to instruction. That's how we trust in the Lord. We have access to the Bible. Here's an example of one of the wisdom teachings that we can examine. Whoever is patient has great understanding. Well, take that time while you're patient and do some information gathering. And by getting more and more information and getting the facts, then we can make a better decision, and this is God's wisdom. This is his guidance for us in all this. We've got to take the time to do that. And if we don't take the time to do that, we can be like the last part of the proverb that says, but the one who is quick-tempered displays folly. Well, if you're not, if you're patient, you might be able to understand why the other person is upset with you. You might be able to find out what's happening in the other person's life. And then have a better understanding of it. Instead of lashing out quickly, with quick temper, anger, and all that, that displays folly. And so we can take God's Word. We can use it, and by using it, by taking the teachings that are there, the statement is made in Proverbs chapter 2, he holds victory in store for the upright. He's a shield to those whose walk is blameless. For he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones. Then you will understand what is right, just and fair, every good path. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will protect you, and understanding will guard you. And so in all of this, what I learned, if I want to gain more courage and more confidence, to have more trust in God, I'm going to pray more. I am going to study God's Word. I'm going to examine it. I'm going to look at it and try to apply the passages to my life. And I'm going to take time with the principles that are there, like being patient, and try to gather up more information so that I can then use God's wisdom to make a better decision about what I do. And in doing that, when we do that, we'll be building more trust in God. And he says that with that trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your path straight. We'll be stronger. We'll make better decisions. We'll have better confidence in this life. And so that's how we do it. Don't set up some sort of signs out there for God to somehow fulfill those signs. Just read his word, pray, trust, and obey. And make the best decision you can in a situation after you've gathered the information. Let's try that. And I think in doing that, we'll be more like Gideon. He was in the heroes of faith, or the hall of faith. We'll have more faith.